Okay, well, it's a pleasure to have here with us Mohammed Elnaiem, who, among many other things, is a student in the PhD program at the University of Cambridge, and he's here to talk to us about our ongoing project with respect to reimagining self-determination for the 21st century. Um, let us begin, Mohammed. Let me ask you the first question. Uh, could you tell us a little bit about your background and about the process by which you came to be awakened in political consciousness?
Yeah, so I am originally from Sudan. I grew up my life moving around my whole entire life. I'd say that my first my segue into politics was actually through religion. There was a time in my life when I was growing up in Saudi Arabia, but from a dissident sect from Sudan called the Republican Brotherhood and Sisterhood, which was a political movement which sought to establish a federalist, socialist Sudan, but also under the precepts of a reimagined form of Islam, which was progressive in nature and very heterodox. And as a result of its agitation against the implementation of Sharia law in Sudan, its leader, Muhammad Taha, was hanged on charges of apostasy. And so for us, like growing up, like the religious and political were not like separate spheres. And my late dad, he was imprisoned in that movement as well. And so like some of my like anger at the kind of form of Islam that was being imposed on us in Saudi Arabia and all of the teachings that were being taught. Your children are going to hell, and your parents are going to hell, these kinds of things. Of course, like we were also quite like quiet about our political and religious beliefs, led to a kind of deep politicization in me and led to my like yearning for reading stuff that could challenge the world that I lived in. And then eventually led to a kind of sensibility in me that's always been averse to any kind of orthodoxy, because I've seen what orthodoxy can do. And I've seen that kind of orthodoxy that I witnessed growing up when I was in Saudi Arabia among the Wahhabis was not very different to the kind of orthodoxy in a different kind of way that was held by some, for example, maybe new atheists, and indeed like even like some Marxist Leninists. In general, I've always just been like averse to political orthodoxy, and that's always been a kind of my approach to politics.
Very interesting. What led you to come to the UK, and how have your political engagements evolved while in the UK?
Right. So I was born in the UK. My parents were persecuted by the Islamist government that took over in 1989, the dictatorship of Umar al-Bashir. And they came to the UK. I was born in the UK in 1992, but I left at the age of 10. My late father was a doctor. We'd moved around, lived in the Middle East for a while. Part of the radicalization process in me that was not necessarily political radicalization. I'd say maybe I was a social democrat at the time, but still my intellectual pursuits were when I was growing up there. Then after a while, I moved to Malaysia. And in Malaysia, I experienced a lot of racism. I still didn't really have the vocabulary to understand it. Of course, it been something I experienced my whole life, but in Malaysia specifically, it was very explicit. There was explicit propaganda against African descendants. You try to get an apartment and you'd be told that you can't because you're Black. And then there were these gangsters, these rampets who would bully us, basically fascists, literally fascists. I mean, they would brandish the swastika even though they were Malay. So strange. But that kind of politicized me on the racial side of things. And then I had got an opportunity. I was studying at a British university, the University of Nottingham. I had an opportunity to go to the US under an exchange program. And I was under the impression that if I go to the US, regardless of the racism I had heard about, it was still a liberal democratic state. And though obviously I was against the kind of right-wing drift that was going on to the country economically, I thought at least the political institutions of the United States would protect me in ways that the political institutions in Malaysia couldn't. But sorry, when I arrived to the US, this was around the time that the Black Lives Matter protests were going on. And I just watched and I witnessed the non-indictment of police officers who clearly extrajudicially executed Black people for no reason except for the threat that they seem to pose as Black people to the economic and political order of the country. And I saw that the institutions lined behind the police and not behind people who on camera were caught. And that radicalized me, and that's how I joined the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, it also meant that I lost my faith in the kind of liberalism that I really believed in up until I arrived to the United States.
And how did you first come into contact with the Kurdish Freedom Movement? And what is your interpretation of the significance of its imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan?
So when I was in the United States, I had been searching, as a lot of us were, for ways that our movement could not be co-opted by the very kind of liberalism that, you know, that I had been disillusioned by, but which was almost like a taken for granted in terms of politics, especially with just the legacies of the civil rights movement. Now, one thing that I retained from the days of being a liberal was my firm commitment in the project of the emancipation of humanity and the human. One thing that I was, particularly averse to in the left was some of the growing anti-humanist traditions. And until today, I don't buy into them. I really do believe in the emancipation of the human being, but I just think that that's just not possible under the present system. And so one of the things that led me first to my interest in the Kurdish movement was its commitment to a humanist project. And it seemed also that, I had eventually developed a criticism of the state. You could say that my politics were moving in the direction of, and maybe I was even once comfortable identifying as an anarchist. And I don't anymore, but at the time I was getting there. And many anarchists at the time were very fascinated in the project of the Kurds, because not only was it this humanist project, but it also seemed to be one of the first national projects with an understanding of emancipation and self-determination against the state and not as trying to get the state. And that's where I situate Öcalan in. I situate Öcalan as an incredibly important figure, because when you command respect for all of the sacrifices that you've done for a movement, it's easy for you to be a leader who takes the most populist position. And he has always remained firm as an intellectual, taking what he feels the most morally correct position, even if it might not be popular. And his position against the state, for example, and his break away from the idea that the Kurdish people needed a state, that was a hugely influential heterodox position, but he took it anyway. His position with siding with the women's liberation movement within the Kurdish movement, so that it becomes at the center of his analysis of oppression and emancipation, was also something really important. I think the most important thing also just is that in a world where, if we look at the vast majority of armed movements, they're trying their very best to just go onto the peace table. We're talking about, for example, FARC in Colombia, we're talking about the PLO in Palestine, but they never try to theorize, because this seems to be just an inevitable historical process that we're going through. They've never tried to theorize what's next, what's the next step, and how do we theorize it. They've instead chosen to accept these peace processes as just capitulating to the system they were fighting against for so long. The Kurdish liberation struggle, through the influence of Öcalan, has tried to theorize what the next step is going to be, because clearly, the world has changed since the 20th century, the early 20th century, and we've learned a lot about the limitations of the state for the quest for self-determination.
Very good. So at Peace in Kurdistan, we're working on a project related to struggles for self-determination in the 21st century, as you know. In your opinion, how can the struggle for self-determination be best conceptualized, especially from a particular Pan-Africanist point of view?
Right. So the thing about the question for self-determination is that we should first historicize it. The conception of self-determination as being getting a state for oppressed peoples, it's not that old, right? The nation state itself, if we look at it through the history of humanity, it's not that old. But the quest for a nation state through the concept of self-determination is definitely not that old. I mean, the earliest conceptions of it we could probably find is Lenin's call for an anti-colonial international with the establishment of the Communist International, and then also Woodrow Wilson's conception of self-determination for oppressed peoples, which he made very clear he didn't believe could be applied to all peoples. Now, the history of decolonization, especially in the African world, has been the history of fighting for the conception of self-determination by getting a nation state. And if we look then at the trajectory that we took since the struggles with decolonization, we should look at all of these different case studies and then ask ourselves whether or not either any of them have provided us with the promise of self-determination that was given to us. And I'd say that in the vast majority of cases, I mean, you can't make one generalization of self-determination of nation states all going bad or all following one trajectory. But the vast majority of trajectories that have taken place since the era of decolonization have created the conditions for a small elite of people, specifically in African countries and Caribbean countries, for example, who have used the mechanisms of the state to enrich themselves and a small clique at the expense of the vast majority of people. And if anything, that should force us to try to reimagine what self-determination can look like in the 21st century. I'm not saying that there should be a dogmatic renunciation of the state, but I am saying that there should be a huge skepticism towards the kind of common sense idea that we've had that the state is the path for people who imagine themselves to be in communion with one another to achieve their self-determination.
So you're currently working hard at work, let's say, trying to finish your PhD dissertation on the impressively broad subject of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Could you explain for us how the concept of self-determination comes into play in your thesis?
Right. So because I'm historicizing the concept of self-determination, one thing about the histories of self-determination is that we have a tendency to take our national histories through a teleological narrative, which assumes that all previous struggles culminated in the independence movement. So if you open up a textbook in Kenya, or you open up a textbook in like the Caribbean or whatever, you'll find all sorts of struggles against colonialism in the past put into one narrative that ends with the independence of Kenya. And that's kind of like the end of history of independent nation states and how they tell themselves and how they mythologize their own past. That's not something that I've done. And in my thesis, I've always tried to see self-determination as only one phase within the broader struggles that were, emerged out of like history of imperialism. And I've always tried to look at self-determination also as a gendered project, because I'm looking at the relationship, as you said, between colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And when we look at it from a gendered project, as a gendered project, we'll also see that beyond just leaving behind the vast majority of people, the nation state has also left behind a lot of the women who were actually like responsible for bringing the nation state into fruition in the first.
Mm, mm. Very interesting again. Among other sites of struggle in which you've been involved, as you've mentioned already, there's the Sudan. Could you tell us a little bit about how the struggle for self-determination is playing itself out there these days?
Sure. So that's another perfect example. You see, I'll just go back to the previous question so that I can sort of situate Sudan within a global setting, right? Sudan is a country that achieved its independence in 1950s, right? It was one of the first countries to, and it achieved its independence through negotiated settlement. There are other countries that achieved their independence through an armed struggle, right? And there are other countries who achieved their independence through a combination of the two, for example, like India. And in the case of Sudan, Sudan is a country that also had the first post-colonial revolution in the history of Africa. We had our first revolution in 1964 because our first civilian government almost immediately handed over power to a military general, General Aboud. In 1964, he was overthrown. So Sudan is a country which, in addition to having a negotiated settlement for its independence in the 1950s, was also the first country to have a post-colonial coup in 1960, a post-colonial revolution in 1964. And that's because it was also one of the first countries to have a post-colonial coup in 1958, when almost immediately power was handed over by civilians to the military. And because of that, Sudan has had a history of revolution, strong trade union movement and trajectories, strong trajectories of resistance, a horrible legacy of coup d'etats. And that has affected the trajectory of the country so that the vast majority of resources and power has been held in the hands of the military, right? There are other countries in post-colonial Africa that followed different trajectories. If you look at a country like Angola, for example, you had a Marxist-Leninist party who led the independence struggle. They quickly took over the military so that the party had paramountcy over the state. And nonetheless, you had the formation of a clique of people who were, within the MPLA, who were the ones who have ended up inheriting most of the country's resources and wealth. Sudan follows a trajectory similar to Egypt in that sense, of it being a sort of a military capitalist kind of country. Now in Sudan, there's a struggle. Recently, just like last week, there was a coup d'etat against a revolution that started in 2018. And now there's a struggle for against the military dictatorship. And you should also see this as a struggle to continue the promises of self-determination from independence. I mean, one thing to understand is that if you're from a country in, say, for example, Latin America, the idea of independence was like a long time ago. It was probably in the 1800s, You don't even have to think about the idea of independence in most of the cases when you come from Europe. But when we're talking about the post-colonial world, I mean, for perspective, like my dad was born before Sudan was an independent country, so we're very young. And so one thing you have to understand about all of these struggles is, yes, a lot of them are struggles for democracy, but beyond that, they're actually struggles for the promises of self-determination and against unbearable odds. The military in Sudan controls the vast majority of the resources and power in the country. And to stand against them seems to be like, a huge challenge. But, we're still doing it anyway. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, in the sense that, like, sure, we're trying to fight for an independent state, but the reality of the matter also is that the state itself shouldn't be taken for granted. The seizure of the state is what allowed for the military to amass so much power in the first place. And the seizure of the state in other countries has what amassed a small, tiny elite to amass so much power. so, the equation of the state with self-determination is just, it seems to be so fallacious right now, after all of the experiences that we've seen since the post-colonial period.
Mm. So just to continue with respect to the events in the Sudan, you've talked to me a little bit about these committees for resistance that are mobilizing right now. I think that might be of interest to people who follow the Kurdish movement with enthusiasm. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more self-organizing aspects of kind of revolutionary developments in contemporary Sudan?
Absolutely. So I would say, for example, in Sudan, there isn't an explicit ethos that's developed itself in a way where it's trying to realize self-determination against the state. But, I would also argue that even those people who may, for example, be influenced by the ideas of Öcalan in Kurdistan, not all of them have accepted that idea as well. It's really hard to get people to imagine the concept of independence and power beyond the nation state. Nonetheless, there are forms of organization, just as there are in Kurdistan, which seem to prefigure a future where people are not governed by a central authority that's over them, that can be easily compromised and bought off. And one of those, for example, is in Sudan's resistance committees. Now, the resistance committees were formed in the first waves of struggle in 2013 and 2011, which were inspired, obviously, by the Arab Spring, but were also more inspired by just the miserable conditions of life that had been happening since I'd say the independence of South Sudan, because Sudan was an oil-based economy, and since the independence of South Sudan itself, a testament to the failure of the self-determination project, considering that not only were people marginalized to the point where they felt oppressed enough to want their own nation states, but that nation state itself devolved very quickly along some of the same lines that Sudan has, with an elite fighting for resources and then fighting each other, millions, thousands dying. But, when South Sudan split and took its oil wealth with it, pushed Sudan into an economic crisis. And that led to a wave of revolts, which were brutally suppressed. And in 2013, understanding the need for organization, people in their neighborhoods began developing these neighborhood councils. And the neighborhood councils would operate clandestinely, but they had respect in their neighborhoods, and they were the ones who mobilized people in the big fashion. Of course, when these neighborhood councils, a lot of the people were arrested, they were persecuted during that first wave. That didn't mean they just disappeared. They just remained dormant until the revolution began in 2018. And that's when the neighborhood councils emerged back to the fore. And with the Sudanese Professionals Association, which was an association of illegal banned unions, it was the neighborhood councils who were responsible for organizing the people to fight against the central authority, which was the state, and following the manifesto of the Sudanese Professionals Association, which had won the hearts and minds of millions of people across Sudan. They were the principal organizers for the resistance that they hoped would push Sudan towards a democratic state. Now, there has been I could go into should I go also into the history of what happens next in the revolution?
Sure. I think people will find that of interest.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go so deep into it, but I'll just say this. Throughout that period, the Sudanese Professionals Association also entered into an alliance with opposition parties. And those opposition parties had worked together under one banner called the Forces of Freedom and Change. But that was to the frustration and anger of the resistance committees, because part of the reason why they rose up was in response to the failure of opposition parties to overthrow the dictatorship of 30 years. Nonetheless, there was this tenuous alliance, and with the protests, regular protests, the organization of strikes through the unions, and then eventually a sit-in in front of the military headquarters to call for the defection of lower ranked soldiers. Eventually, the dictator was overthrown on April 11th, 2018. But the Sudanese Professionals Association and the resistance committees refused to vacate the premises of the military headquarters, arguing that they were going to stay until full civilian rule. What ends up happening, though, on June 3rd, 2019, was this is just a few months after April, the dictator was overthrown. The sit-in was violently dispersed. People were massacred. Live bodies were thrown in the Nile. And eventually, after that, a general strike was called for, which shut down the economy. And then a Millions March, which led to an agreement between military and civilians through outside intervention. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United States tried to prevent full civilian rule, fearing what it would imply. And so they agreed to a compromise. That compromise was ended last week when the military did a full coup, arrested the prime minister, arrested most of the civilian members of the Sovereign Council, put in jail the people who were manning or who were in control of one of the most important institutions, the Empowerment Removal Committee, which was tasked with expropriating the assets of the former regime. So that's this kind of situation that we're in now. The most important part is that now the Sudanese Professionals Association and the resistance committees have shown themselves to be quite independent from the political parties. They have attacked the political parties' tendency to capitulate on the negotiating table with the military. And most importantly, the neighborhood councils now, at least one of them in the city of Sinnar, have gone so far as to propose that maybe it's the neighborhood councils who should be tasked with ruling the country through a direct democratic vision of immediate recall of representatives of the neighborhood councils and the creation of what they call people's power and a government run by the people, which is completely against the aspirations of the military. That has only been one neighborhood committee who's released that, and it's a neighborhood committee in a peripheral city, not in the capital city. But I'm personally hoping that that vision takes off, and so that we can start to imagine and reimagine new forms of sovereignty and self-determination.
Yeah. So there's obviously a looming threat of the potential of a civil war breaking out, and thinking as well about the question of the intervention of regional and global powers in events in the Sudan. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of geopolitics of the situation and how that may or may not affect the struggle for self-determination on the ground?
Sure. I mean, the geopolitics of the situation is that so the Sudanese people have been very committed to the idea of the revolution being nonviolent. The civilians and the nonviolent organizations, including the resistance committees, have also been very clear that they would like to, they also entered into an alliance with armed forces, armed militias, who also insisted that the revolution remain nonviolent, and have all announced their unilateral ceasefires. And the reason for this is, of course, learning from the lessons from Libya, Syria, etc. And I think that personally is a quite strategic and wise decision to make. Nonetheless, a lot of the foreign powers that you see in other countries since the Arab Spring are the same ones involved in Sudan. And one of the reasons for this is fear of civilian rule, what that kind of wave can send to the other countries in the region. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, or Sisi in particular, have been the ones to intervene the most directly into the affairs of Sudan. And they've been intervening on the side of the military, providing the military with aid, etc. The European powers have been happy, they claim, or excited to see a civilian transition, however imperfect, to eventual elections. And they said that they would be happy to try to provide support to the civilian government. But of course, these have come with strings attached, austerity measures, the devaluation of the currency, trade liberalization policies, the kind of things that actually led to the uprising in 2018 in the first place. And so even now in the post-coup era, the European powers, in addition to their allies, and that's what they are, they're allies, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they've all been working to try to bring back the old status quo, which is a civilian military partnership. And the people on the ground have made themselves very clear that they want a complete civilian transition. One thing to also understand about Sudan's entry into the international sphere after the revolution is that it also came, the United States imposed on Sudan an ultimatum. It said, first you have to pay reparations to the United States. And Sudan's a cash-strapped poor country. You have to pay reparations to the tune of 315 million for crimes that your regime committed in sponsoring terror, sponsoring Osama bin Laden, sponsoring attacks on the embassy, the US embassy in Kenya, etc. And for perspective, I mean, the UK government provided about 13 million pounds, $13 million to Mau Mau, only 5,000 Mau Mau people in reparations. But Sudan, a poor country, was forced to pay 12, 13 times that amount to one of the richest countries in the world. In order to have the state sponsor of terror list removed from it and to have sanctions removed. So that was that should demonstrate, I think, the goodwill that the Sudanese people faced in joining the international community. But the second thing, which the military was happy to broker, was that the United States imposed on Sudan that it normalized relations with Israel for it to also have the state sponsor of terror list removed from it. And this is at a time when Israel is under a very right-wing government, when Israel is increasing its illegal settlements, when Israel has done everything it can to make the two-state solution less tenuous, and has done nothing in its power to win the hearts and minds of people who stand against, quite frankly, the occupation of the Palestinian people. And that could only, of course, that embarrassed the civilian government, because the United States and Israel went behind the civilian government's back and forced the agreement on Burhan, the guy who just committed the coup. So in general, I would say that while the Western powers claim to be on the side of the Sudanese people fighting for democracy, they have posed immense obstacles. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt have been more forthcoming about their loyalties, and they have been more straightforward about what their interests are. And Russia has openly gone in the United Nations to try to dilute any forms of condemnation against the junta, which is running Sudan, calling this needless intervention in the affairs of Africa, in the affairs of Sudan, which only shows that Russia, of all of these countries, is probably the last bastion of dictatorship in the world. And it seems to be its sole purpose in its foreign policy approach to the democratic struggles in the region.
All right.
So it's us against the world.
Yeah. Sobering. So what is your take? We'll end by changing the subject a little bit, I suppose. What is your take on the imperative for internationalism? And how does it relate to trends in so-called identity politics in general, and with respect to Afro-pessimism in particular?
Yeah, I mean, look, all of this is leading us, I mean, all of the problems of self-determination and our disillusionment with the state, for example, Afro-pessimism, for example, different forms of identity politics which are growing. Even though, of course, I'm also someone who's engaged in fighting for the Black identity, but still the specific form of identity politics that are emerging, Afro-pessimism being the most extreme. All of these I see as different ways of us trying to theorize and understand a world that has left us pessimistic about the prospects of the nation state, in realizing our goals, you know. I mean, it makes absolute sense to me that at a time when identities themselves are fighting against each other for the crumbs of the empire, in the case of those who, for example, live in it, the US, the UK, and fighting against each other using concepts like anti-Blackness, this, that, to just cover the fact that they want the tenure in the universities, or they want the, you know, certain kinds of alleviation from the state, or for example, the emergence of the African descendants of slavery movement in the United States, which has pitted itself against Caribbean and African descendants, saying that these people are taking our affirmative action and they're taking our scholarships. I mean, that for me is ultimately the dead end of the nation state, right? In that it ossifies communities, and then it forces them against each other to compete against each other for what the nation state cannot offer. You know, because the nation state is buttressed on violence, and it's also buttressed on centralization tendencies where it creates a small elite at the top. And so even in our post-colonial nation states in Sudan, or in Africa especially, almost immediately during the decolonization process, for example, you had the unity of various different tribes, often under the idea of an abstract nation fighting against alien rule and against colonialism. Almost immediately, once the state was seized, the fragmentation of that coalition of different tribes begins to happen. And then people start to see themselves as, for example, I'm an Anglophone Cameroonian and you're a Francophone Cameroonian, right? Or I am a Denke and you're a Nuer. Or I am a Kikuyu and you're a Luo, you know? And that becomes the way in which politics fragments, you know? And that ultimately is no different than exactly the kind of fragmentation I was talking about in the empire. That's what the nation state does, right? And then just beyond that, like if you look at the case of, for example, the military seizing power in Sudan, or you look at an unaccountable bureaucracy, for example, seizing power in Zimbabwe or Angola, you also start to see that these ossification of identity and this fragmentation along identitarian lines is often just a way to mask elite competition over the resources of the state, you know? And this is, and so the summoning of people along the lines of identity is often that. And unfortunately, that doesn't just include the politicians who are in control. That also includes, at some point, the groups and even armed groups who speak on behalf of their own abstract nation, but find themselves also in the negotiating table. They too end up speaking on behalf of the people of Darfur or the people of the Nuba Mountains, and then finding themselves in a situation like we have now. You know, I mean, we have a tendency, I think, to fetishize the armed struggle in the name of oppressed nations. But what we also need to open our minds to is that everybody, insofar as the nation state exists, and is the forum by which people fighting for different causes, you know, brings those people together, then we're all susceptible, regardless of how just our causes are, to the exact problems that we see in so many different places. I think that's the lesson I think people need to learn the most about the nation state. It's not that power corrupts or anything like that. It's that the institution or the amalgamation of institutions it represents are so dirty that even the cleanest people with the most just causes end up being compromised by even coming close to it, touching it. And that requires us to really think about, if we really do believe in the idea of the emancipated human being who is raceless, genderless, classless, moneyless, if we really believe in that aspiration, the nation state, I'm not calling for a complete divestment from it because I know how impractical that is. But if we cannot imagine its overthrow or a world without it, then there is no point in the idea of self-determination in the first place. Because I mean, for some people, they really do believe in the ossified nation, that self-determination, that's supposed to achieve its self-determination. For me, I see self-determination as a necessary process in maybe the abolition of the very nation which advocates for it. And this is maybe my more utopian side. And the nation state doesn't do that. The nation state forces people to it forces people eventually into a concept of blood and soil. And we know where blood and soil takes us. Blood and soil takes us to fascism. You know, that's its logical endpoint. And that's the case not just for, but that doesn't mean I'm against like the struggles for independence or I'm not appreciative of the struggles before us. I'm just saying that we genuinely need to think beyond it. Although, for the sake of our species, for the sake of our survival. You know, I don't have the answers for how, but when I see the neighborhood councils, when I see the radical democratic movement in Kurdistan, I see a glimpse of hope in there. But we have to be more explicit about where we're going. To convince millions of people of that goal, it might be difficult, but you know, I'll just end on this. When you read C.L.R. James's reflection on George Padmore, memorializing George Padmore after he died, he says that in the 1930s, when they were organizing for independence, with the first the United Friends of Abyssinia, but then the International African Service Bureau, everyone thought that they were crazy, you know. When there was like a young Nnamdi Azikiwe and a young Kwame Nkrumah, and even a young Jomo Kenyatta, perfect example of someone who shows in just his name and his very existence criticism of the project of self-determination. But even Jomo Kenyatta, all of them, when they were imagining independent states, people thought they were crazy. So I do believe that it's possible for us to reach a step of self-determination where we imagine the concept beyond the nation state, and then eventually imagine ourselves, live in a world where there is no self to achieve self-determination, where we are all human beings before anything else, and that's it, you know. And that's the goal that I fight towards. That's how I see myself. I see myself as an identity abolitionist in that sense, even though I believe in fighting on the basis of identity until its abolition. You know, I love the people of Sudan. There's no doubt about it. You can even say maybe I'm patriotic, but I don't love my people more than I love anybody else's, because we're all human beings. And that's the kind of cosmopolitan understanding of personhood that I wish, you know, that we could all as a species come towards. Especially the pandemic proved that, and the climate catastrophe that faces us, that confronts us, it should also push us in that direction. So yeah, I guess that's probably how I think about the concept of self-determination.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for magisterial discussion, many fronts. Any last words for us?
Yeah, I think I just say this on the question of self-determination, just a final reflection. Recently, we saw the release of the Pandora Papers, a cache of over 2 million documents that proves the implication. It proves that like the complicity of various nation states, leaders of and heads of nation states and their political elites from all over the world working together against the vast majority of the population. We saw absurd stories like the head of the Azerbaijan nation state selling property to the queen, right? We saw stories of daughter of Marxist rebellion becoming the first billionaire by using the state to enrich herself so that she could invest in Portugal, right? And I think all of our old concepts of self-determination and even independence and even neocolonialism don't prepare us for an understanding of this. But one thing I'll say is this, is that Mau Mau undoubtedly in Kenya leveled one of the most heroic struggles against British colonialism. Until today, there are Mau Mau who have refused to shave their dreadlocks. And if you ask them why, they'll tell you that they will not shave their dreadlocks because the Kenya that they wanted to fight for never came into fruition. These Mau Mau who risked their lives and who, quite frankly, Kenya would have never been independent had they not fought, live in poverty today, okay? And Jomo Kenyatta and his cronies were the ones who reaped the benefit by becoming the first prime minister and then grew to a constitutional change, the first president of Kenya. Kenyatta built an empire. He expropriated the vast majority of the land of the European people, kept it in his family. Then under the Moi dictatorship, all of that power was centralized under a kleptocracy. The reason why I bring all of this up is because the Pandora Papers also show that Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenyatta's son, who's also the president of Kenya, who fought for the presidency of Kenya on a campaign against corruption, was found to have millions of dollars in over 13 offshore companies, money that he most likely extracted from the Kenyan people to go and hide elsewhere so that he could hide his assets and live in luxury. A huge amount of Kenyan people still live in slums. That, I think, proves to us that the idea that the nation state corresponds directly to the aspirations and demands of the so-called nation, that's just false. Once we start to understand that, that should be the beginning of the moment when we need to understand that the next phase of the big next emancipatory project, and I do think the independence struggles of the 20th century were an emancipatory project. The next emancipatory project should be of figuring out how we move first of a concept of self-determination beyond the nation state, and then of a concept of the determination of humanity beyond the selves that we imagine to inhabit. So that sort of is my last thought. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Mohammed.
Thanks.